Hey LinkedIn, and welcome to Business Unusual. This is a live show where we talk about the changing nature of work. I'm Susie Jackson. I'm a news editor at LinkedIn, coming to you live from my home in New York City. Protests over the killing of unarmed Black citizens continue to rip through the US this week, despite curfews and concerns about possible new surges of COVID 19. On Business Unusual this week, we have had conversations about being an active ally at work, about the shift in the way corporations are responding publicly to the issue of race. And today on the show, we want to drill down a bit further into what we might do to build more equitable workplaces. I want to hear from you on this topic. I want to hear what you're seeing on the ground, where you are, what you're experiencing in these trying times. Talk to me in the comments, talk to one another. It's really great to see the shows of support in the community on this show, and we're going to get to as much of your questions, your comments, your statements today as possible. Later on in the episode, we are going to hear from the founder of a diversity and inclusion consultancy who's worked across the public and private sector, as well as the CEO and founder of a women's networking company. Both of these women taking action right now. But first, I want to make sure that we are all trying to start from a similar place of understanding. The first guest I'd like to bring out is Dr. Courtney Cogburn. She is a professor at Columbia University who researches racism and how it leads to racial inequalities in health. Dr. Cogburn, thank you for joining us on the show today.
Hi, I'm happy to join you.
I'm really happy to have you. We were talking the other day, and you were telling me that you're tired of having basic conversations about racism with people who think that they're not part of this situation. They might not see themselves through a racist lens because they're not burning crosses or using bad language. But your work says that your work challenges that notion that this is really a conversation that everyone needs to be having. What would you say to the people who haven't thought they're part of this conversation? How should they be thinking about this right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think in my work, I definitely have centered white liberals in particular in thinking about their role in benefiting from and perpetuating systems of racial oppression. And I think that's a really different way for most people to talk about and think about and consider these issues, especially people who aren't the direct targets of those oppressions. So the way that I like to talk about this is, like, as you just mentioned, just because you're not carrying a torch or burning crosses or going to, secret clandestine meetings doesn't mean that you aren't part of a racist system. And we really have to broaden and complicate the ways in which we talk about racism and how it manifests in our society. And I think once we do that, it'll become clearer about it will become clearer how our organizations are perpetuating some of these same oppressions within our internal systems, and that it's not just police violence or vigilante violence out there, that these very same phenomena are manifesting perhaps in different ways, but in still violent ways within our own organization. So I think that shift in framing is really important, because once we do that, we take accountability and our solutions start to shift as well.
Yeah, what I'm hearing is it's been hard for some people to see that they are a part of this. And that leads me to a question about some of the important work that you've done. In 2018, you released an immersive VR experience in partnership with Stanford called The Thousand Cut Journey. And it gives viewers the experience of going through life as a Black boy, then a teenager, and then a man. We're seeing some shots of it here. Can you tell us about that simulation and why it was important to show the progression in age?
Yeah, so this was a project that we developed in collaboration with the Virtual Human Interaction Lab at Stanford University. It's called A Thousand Cut Journey. We really wanted to convey that racism, in terms of direct experiences, is something that happens very early in life. It carries across the life course, childhood, adolescence, etc. It's not just police violence. It happens in one's community, at work, in the classroom. So it was our initial attempt to try and convey to people that racism is multidimensional. It crosses time and context. It's not just someone calling you a name. It's not just police violence. And so this was an effort to try and convey that in a more complex and visceral way to really targeting, again, white liberal audiences.
And I want to take just a quick moment to say hello to some people who are joining us in the stream. We have Ruthie from Seattle, Adrian from Chicago, Alfred from Hollywood. Welcome back, Alfred. Rona is from India. Sherry is from New Jersey. Dr. Cogburn, you're talking about this being multi-dimensional. It's crossing time, age, space. This in the name itself, a thousand cuts. It's not these single overt things. You can safely say, I'm not a racist because I don't X, but it's really about these smaller things, the look that you might get if you're a person of color versus if you're me in certain situations. I want to know. You talked about white liberals being the intended audience. What were some of the responses that you thought you were going to get? And in the rollout, it's been a year or so since people have been experiencing this and you've been having these conversations. What are the responses that you're getting?
Yeah. So just quickly, I think what we're talking about is not just sort of microaggressions, the more subtle ways that one might experience racism directly. We're really trying to convey that this exists in systems and our policies that systematically disadvantage groups of people. That's in the workplace, that's in medicine and healthcare, et cetera. But in terms of the reactions that we're getting from white liberal audiences, I think in some ways this piece was really timely, and that target group was in a place where they were ready to have, on average, more difficult conversations about this. And so, what I found is that when people come out of this piece, they are saying things like, I've thought about this, I've engaged, I've signed petitions, I've been at the protests, I've been marching, but I never understood it like this. It never really hit me like this. And that is very, very meaningful for me. When we first started designing this piece, we wanted white people to come out saying, I thought I understood this, but I don't. And we wanted Black people to register this experience as authentic and meaningful, even if just a slice of what they experience on a day-to-day basis.
It sounds like the VR component was really crucial to that. Would you expect that to happen? Did you expect that bigger jump in responses given this format than perhaps in other avenues you've taken your work on before this?
I honestly had no idea, Susie. I had never used VR when I first started this project, which is why my collaboration with Jeremy Balinson at Stanford was so critical. I had hopes that it could be powerful. I had hopes that this would be a complement to the vast body of empirical data, historical analysis, the writing that's been done, the journalism that's been done, trying to convey the significance of these issues. But I consistently saw people reject the data, try to explain these phenomena away, create distance between themselves and these racist phenomena. So it was my hope that the VR could be different and more personal and, again, visceral. And I think we definitely hit that mark. We're still working, trying to create new pieces and pushing the boundaries of how we're using VR. But I think this first piece really did what I hoped it would do, although I was uncertain at the beginning.
Yeah, I think the name is so powerful because it's in the experience that you're having as the viewer. But I also it resonates with me in the experience of hearing the excuses people make in individual situations. Well, you're just you took it the wrong way, or you're not seeing it in whatever way. I think it's really amazing how it puts you in that perspective to see what it feels like to be on the other side of that. That over time, that really adds up to something.
Yeah.
We're seeing Ronique in the stream saying the best advice I can give is to get out of your comfort zone as often as possible. I think that for what it sounds like, people who've gone through this experience are definitely out of their comfort zones. It's not available publicly right now, and partially because when someone goes through this experience, you want to have a conversation with them afterwards. What have some of those conversations been like?
Yeah, so we're not making it publicly available because not that I have to be the one to facilitate the conversation, although I often am, but we want people to be able to place this experience in a broader context. We want people to reflect on their own organizations, their own schools, themselves in relation to what they've experienced in the piece. We've also found that the piece can be quite emotional. It's not uncommon for people to cry and be very upset. And so that's another piece of where we want to help um, take care of, in some ways, the user that's coming through the experience. So what we've been doing so far is using it in sort of private engagements with companies, at universities, so that we can build a conversation around it in a way that helps the processing of what you've gone through become more meaningful and potentially translate beyond the headset.
Yeah, and vulnerability is a word that was coming up in our conversations, that people are leaving this experience feeling vulnerable and therefore more open to having a different kind of conversation. Since it's not available publicly yet, can you recommend anything that someone could think about or to do to try and get in that more vulnerable state, to try and be more empathetic to the situation?
I think, based on our conversation earlier, Susie, I think part of what's really important is for people to make a mental shift in accepting that they are beneficiaries of these problems, and that they contribute to these problems. And that can be a difficult reckoning for some people, but it's an important step. And I think once people start to accept that this is very much so your problem, this is not a Black problem, this is in fact a white problem. And once we accept the nature of whiteness and white supremacy and racism in our society, we start to shift and think about the problem in really different ways and start to take accountability in different ways, potentially. But ultimately, I think one of the first steps, and I can recommend, what to read. You can look at all the things I've been retweeting on my Twitter feed, the brilliant minds from around the country and activists working in these spaces. There's plenty to read and pay attention to, but I think there's a framing shift that needs to happen and a reckoning with so many people who overly invest in the symbolism of liberalism. They invest in the symbols that make them look like someone who is liberal. They invest in an identity as being liberal. And too often that identity does not translate into engagement. It doesn't translate into behavior. There's a gap between what people say they believe and what they're doing. And this is true at the individual level. It's true in terms of organizations. A lot of my colleagues have been talking about the statements released around Black Lives Matter from major institutions, higher institutions of higher learning, private corporations, et cetera, around Black Lives Matter. We'll be paying close attention to whether you actually translate that into action in your own organizations, because we're well beyond the symbol of investment. We're well beyond the symbols of liberalism and commitment to equity. And people are really looking for action and have been for some time.
Thank you for that. And we're hearing that through the stream too. Tana says it's great that companies are putting out well-crafted messages of support and displeasure with racism against Black people, but show us pictures of your leadership team from mid-level to C-suite. Where is your D&I demonstrated in those spaces? So I think we're hearing that from the stream as well. Courtney, Dr. Cogburn, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. I'm hopeful that if the simulation becomes public, that a lot of our viewers, I myself am interested in doing it at some point. Thank you for sharing us with us what you found.
Yeah, thank you for having me and highlighting these issues. Thanks.
So we've heard from Dr. Cogburn that this is everyone's problem, that we need to take accountability and translate our uncomfortable feelings that we're having into actual action. We talked about vulnerability as well. I think vulnerability is something that's very powerful. It's a powerful route to understanding. It's also not something we're necessarily comfortable or used to dealing with in the workplace. So to talk through that a little bit, I wanted to bring out my next two guests, and they are Dr. Atia Martin. She has a long career in the public and private sector, is currently the CEO and founder of All Aces, Inc., a diversity and inclusion consultancy in Boston, Massachusetts. And Tiffany Dufu, who is the founder and CEO of the Crew, a networking organization for women. Thank you both for joining me today.
Thanks for having us. Thank you.
You're welcome. Tiffany, I want to start with you. You are the leader of your own company. A lot of people, individuals, a lot of people who run companies don't quite know how to respond right now. You had a great post on LinkedIn the other day where you were walking through the woods and you saw this beautiful, huge uprooted tree, and it struck a metaphor for you. Can you tell us about that and your thoughts on how one can look inward to find the best way for themselves or their company to respond?
Yes, absolutely. First of all, I was walking in the woods because I was clearing my head and just in the midst of this crisis, and just want to reiterate that, taking care of yourself is of the utmost importance. But I saw this really fascinating image of a tree that had clearly faced a storm, but was refusing to completely topple over. And the roots of the tree were holding up these huge boulders that were revealed. And I just thought it was a very fascinating metaphor of our nation right now and the roots of our democracy being about equality and being about everyone's voice being heard, but having these rocks, of racism, of white supremacy, that if you try to excavate from those roots may damage the tree, and yet it was so, the roots were so strong that it was holding it up. And it was just a moment for me. What I call a Tiffany's epiphany. So, I think that vulnerability is really important. I think that truth telling in leadership is needed now more than ever. I founded a company called The Crew that matches women who then collaborate to meet their life goals together. And one of the reasons why The Crew works is because it's a group of people who care about you but are not invested in your decision making, and you're able to be your authentic self, and you're able to really move forward, not having concern about whether or not your choices might impact them and their life. But in a leadership role, I feel it's so important that we're cognizant of integrity. And Dr. Cogburn said it best when she talked about the difference between your beliefs and your behavior. All of these statements that are being put out, but then looking at what, their leadership looks like, and that not reflecting maybe the sentiment that they're putting out. That is the crux of what is required in order for us to really be able to move our nation forward. Leaders whose beliefs and whose behavior is aligned. And whenever we don't have that, we've seen the results of it. My favorite definition of leadership is by a man named Marshall Gans at Harvard. He says that leadership is enabling others to achieve a shared purpose in the face of uncertainty. I cannot think of a more uncertain time than we are in right now. And you having clarity about your purpose, what it is that you need to be doing, also what you need to be feeling right now in this moment, and being transparent and real, with your team, I think is incredibly important.
Yeah, that transparency, that realness. We're talking about the difference between the statements companies are making and how they're actually acting. Dr. Martin, I want to ask you, we are seeing more companies come out and talk about racism in ways that I have not seen. But what does it really mean to take action? When your firm is called into a company, how do you ask companies to take a hard look at themselves? It can be really uncomfortable.
It definitely is. So first of all, thank you, Susie, for having me on. And I think the discomfort that we feel is connected to some foundational challenges we have that are part of the human condition, right? And so what makes racism and other forms of oppression, and oppression in general, very complicated is it sits on top of a number of issues like our psychology, how we've been socialized, neuroscience, right, at a foundational level, where we are in our human development. And so then you layer racism on top of that, and it becomes very complicated. So for our organization, what we try to do is help to normalize certain realities. We work to normalize the fact that that we are people, and that organizations and the policies we make, that what we do internally and externally actually is influenced by all of the external socialization and pressures that we're getting. So the rest of society expects organizations to be structured in a certain way. So we work with organizations to look at, okay, let's look at the way your organization operates. So what is the strategic language that you have? And how does the strategic language, and when I say that, I mean your mission, your vision, your values, what is the explicit way that connects to your commitment to equity? That's the first layer, right? And that's symbolic. And then the other layers are, well, what are the ways that you make decisions in the organization? And is there transparency in how decisions get made, and who has the authority to make certain decisions and who doesn't, and how what is the way that certain big decisions that impact everybody in the organization get raised up to a higher level, so that there can be true engagement within the organization. We often talk about community engagement as an external process we do with people in communities in cities and towns across the country, that we have to have that same perspective internally in our organizations. People show up to work every day looking for ways to be developed, right? They're looking for support. They're looking for ways that the organization is going to help them to fulfill their purpose in life, or what they see their purpose is, or to even better understand those things. And that's what the research shows us. And so the more that we can be very explicit about walking through these different pieces of our organizational development layers, and look for the equity opportunities. How are we structured, right? How do promotions happen? Is that transparent, right? So if it's hard for people of color to navigate in an organization, right, it means that it's hard for lots of people in the organization to navigate. It's just worse for us as people of color. It's worse for me as a Black woman when I enter an organization because of racism. So the challenges, the problems of the organization become bigger problems and challenges for me and my experience in the organization. And so when people of color are calling out certain injustices, certain experiences they're having in an organization, it's not just an individual experience. It means that there's something wrong, there's something broken in structure, process, culture, the way that we're doing things. And so the organizations have to not be afraid to ask the question, what is it that I'm doing as an organization that could be facilitating this experience that people are having? What are we not doing maybe that is facilitating this experience? And then the last piece is, you know, a lot of times we talk about DEI work separate from organizations, right? What we do in organizations, like that's that thing that happens over there. And when we have time for it, we'll get to it. When the reality is, it has to be baked into every layer of how we do things. It can't be a separate activity. It's not an extracurricular activity if we're really doing it. And the last thing I say, I know I said that twice. This is my second time saying it, but the last piece really is this idea of the organizations that people really want to work in, that do well, that are developmental to their employees, are the places that people of color want to work. And that means that's the place that everybody wants to work. If it's in reverse, and if people of color don't want to work there, right? That means that you have some actual problems in the organization, and a lot of people who are there probably don't want to be there either.
Yeah, yeah. So we're talking about marginalized communities, but you're saying that that's really kind of a canary in a coal mine. That if there's one group being silenced or not being able to feel comfortable enough at work, that structure applies to everyone. So what else are you missing as a leader? Monique in the stream is right on board with this. She says these issues can no longer be pushed under the rug or passed by. I'm so glad conversations like these are becoming more frequent. So it is difficult for companies to really take these hard looks at themselves. Tiffany, as a leader of your company, how do you think about building trust with your employees and creating those spaces where they can come and be their authentic selves? I know you're having a lot of conversations about this with your team at the top of every meeting lately. How do you build that space?
Well, my life's work is advancing women and girls. That's pretty much why I'm on the planet. And I'm very driven by that passion and by that purpose. Everyone on my team knows that. They know what my highest allegiance is to, and they understand that the decisions that I make are in the best interest, not just of the bottom line for a company, but of achieving a higher purpose. So, one way that I try to build trust in these conversations is by reminding people of who I am and why I'm here. And that's really important because right now, there's very little that people know for sure. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of chaos. Maya Angelou once said that people don't remember what you said and they won't remember what you did. People will only remember how you made them feel, which is why that virtual reality, that VR exercise that Dr. Cogburn was taking people through is so valuable. And I think it's really important that when you decide to lead the conversation, when you decide to announce what the strategy is going to be, that you engage people in the process and that you really factor in and think about how would that make someone feel as you're making these decisions. I think it's really important to narrow the scope of the conversation. So I try not to just open with, so how are you doing? Or how are you feeling? Because that could potentially open up the floodgates or cause someone who's not comfortable sharing how they're feeling in the workplace, put pressure on them to perform when really you're more well-intentioned than that. And so we will ask questions like, everyone just share one word, that reflects your sentiment right now. So I think narrowing the scope of the dialogue and the conversations, I think rooting yourself as a leader in what matters most to you, your own authenticity, your own passion and purpose, so that people trust you and believe you, and being honest when you don't know what the answer is. I was honest with, my team a couple of days ago when I said, people are putting out all of these statements I feel a lot of pressure as a Black female founder to put out a statement, but I can't bring myself to put out a statement saying that Black lives matter. That to me is so obvious. So I have to figure out how I draft as a Black person a statement, showing my affirmation for what I feel should be just a fundamental truth. And people appreciate that. People offer to draft something. People say maybe there's another strategy that we could use. So I think being vulnerable, speaking your truth, and asking for help can engender a lot more trust of people than you pretending that you know it all, that you have all of the solutions. And that's why reaching out to people like Dr. Martin, is really important for any leader who is trying to figure out what to do. You call Dr. Martin, you call Dr. Cogburn, and you pay them you compensate them for their talent and for their advice.
Yeah, well, I'm glad that we get a little free taste of it today, but I agree. Call these people, pay them. What you just described sounds exhausting. On top of what's already a really difficult time. Thank you for sharing that with us. I'm sorry that that's an additional pressure that's now mounting on you.
Well,
and I want to take a question from the stream here. I think for Dr. Martin, this would be a good one for you. Isha asks, what are some tangible actions that companies can take to promote DEI in the workplace? A lot of organizations have shared their commitments to support this movement. So what can they really do to make a solid difference?
So the first step is to turn inward. I think there's a temptation to look at what everybody else is doing and to be critical of other folks. And so the opportunity that we have in these moments is to own our agency. And in owning our agency as individuals and as organizations comes with a certain level of responsibility, comes with a certain level of effort. And so being able to look honestly at not just the diversity pieces, but how are we developing our employees? What kind of experiences are we giving them so that they can show up in the space and be their full selves? What are our values? Because I think what we've done up to this point in the workplaces, we've put an emphasis on all of the boxes and squares and arrows that make up the organization and not the actual people. We say that people are our most important asset, but we don't behave as if they are. And so making sure that we're centering people and rehumanizing people in the organization. So what that means practically is that we're taking seriously we actually develop processes for when someone comes with a challenge, an issue towards the organization, that there's an actual process for how that gets handled. And not just from a compliance perspective, in terms of harassment or those kind of things, but more from a restorative justice, more from a let's help to facilitate manage how we manage conflict in the organization, so that these are skills and talents that people need in order to be in space together. The other piece I'll say is how you spend your money matters. The racial wealth gap is the biggest challenge we face as a society, and is connected to so many other challenges that people of color are dealing with, especially in the Black community. And so how you spend your money as an organization matters. So even if you don't have a lot of diversity, that doesn't mean that there aren't challenges in the organization. How we spend our money is a way to literally put our money where our mouth is. So I see all the words coming out from organizations. And so I would like to see more of the action, as much action as there are words that are coming from organizations, including contracting for equity. So not just, what we spend food money on, right? But also like how we partner with other organizations. If you do work that goes into communities, how are you spending that money in the community? How are you hiring people for the community or subcontracting with them? And then the last thing I'll say is when we think about the biggest opportunities in organizations, they really are about the biggest opportunities for the organization to get better. And again, I can't reinforce that enough, that the way an organization operates and is structured in its culture, because every organization has a culture. Most of the time it's unintentional. And when it's unintentional, it looks like the rest of society. And it means that people who are part of underestimated groups in our society bear the brunt of all the problems of the organization. And so if we're honest and open about that, and we're honest and open that we as people have an impact on those experiences of folks in our organization, to really own that and create opportunities for employees to work through these issues with the organization. The more transparent we are, the more minds we have working on these issues, the more likely we're going to come up with policies, programs, approaches, culture that actually in the organization.
I think that's so interesting. That's a great point about if you're not intentional about your culture, you just have what's around, what you're left with, and that's maybe not the thing that you're working towards. Tiffany, pivoting off of that, talk to me about leadership right now. In thinking about that intentionality, it's a tough time. There's no playbook. There are no correct or decisions to follow right now. How do you want leaders to think through what they're doing now and how they might look back in the future on that?
I want leaders to feel first. Actually, right now, I think that helps because you addressing your own emotions is part of what is going to help you to decide what to think, and then obviously what to do. So I think that's first and foremost. I think that for those of us who may be ill-equipped or feel like we need to get help, I think we need to ask for that now. Now is not the time to feel like I should have known the answer. All of us need to increase our level of cultural competency. If you're someone who doesn't even recognize, that your identity is constructed, meaning that if you're a white person who doesn't really understand what that means in our society and that that's a made up identity, just like Blackness is a made up identity, then there are a ton of resources that you can access in order to help educate yourself. And I think it's really important that you think about your teams and your people and how this is impacting them in a very visceral way. And you allow them the space to be human in this moment. That might mean that you decide we're going to cease operations for a day, just so that everyone can kind of clear their minds, figure out, what they can do and how they can feel in their personal life. It might mean that you share an internal statement with them, first before it goes public, to ensure that the people who actually spend, their gifts, talents, skills, abilities toward your brand, toward your company, your mission, are in alignment with what you're putting out in the world so that they can feel proud, of that message. There are so many things that we can do, but I think the first and foremost is for you to feel what is happening right now, for you to recognize that all of us have a role to play in it, and that we all, can really move this forward if we're honest with ourselves about the power and the influence that we hold and how we can move it forward. And all of us have points of privilege in our lives. As a Black woman, I feel the sting of racial injustice. I feel the sting of sexism. But I am also a straight person who is able-bodied, who is middle class, who has a very small body frame, which means I have privilege in this society. I am a well-networked person. I'm one of a few women of color, Black women in particular, who have ever raised more than $1 million in venture capital for their companies. So while, I sometimes just want to slice myself into my most marginalized sections and amplify that and use that as a cry, and a plea, I also recognize that there are aspects of my identity that position me to affect change in a really powerful way, in a really unique way. And I'm trying to leverage that in order to help make the world a better place for all of us, including my children.
And I would like to build on that, Susie, because I think that's a really important point, because it gets back to this agency piece. In that, in addition to the binary of how the dichotomy of kind of dominant groups that we might fall into and non-dominant groups we might fall into, even within non-dominant groups, there's privilege that comes with accepting dominant group behavior and culture. And so I know we've been talking a lot about white people in their role, but I don't want to reinforce powerlessness of people of color. There's a lot that we can do that can hold up systems of oppression. And so for us, there's work that we have to do as well in order to unlearn a lot of behaviors that can, even when we're in positions of power and authority, that give us the tools that we need in order to not reinforce oppression as we're working towards advancing equity, because they conflict with one another, right? You can't leverage oppression as a tactic or a tool to get to equity, especially if we're not clear that that's actually what we're doing, right? And so really taking the time to learn and grow for ourselves. I know a lot of the equity work focuses on what white people need to do, but also there's a lot of skills and knowledge we need in order to own our power and our agency in the spaces that we're in, and how to communicate in those moments where we are confronted with racism, that there's actually a work that we're doing to prepare ourselves for those moments, because they are inevitable, and so that when we're not shocked by the experience, that we don't actually respond in a way that's actually helpful for us, and how we have to still navigate and experience the spaces that we're in, especially if they're predominantly white spaces.
Yeah, Dr. Martin, I know you said equity doesn't happen by accident. I'm so glad that you could each join us today. Tiffany, talking to us about checking in with your feelings first, and moving really intentionally from that space. Equity doesn't happen by accident. I hope that we can use these tools to move forward and start to fix some of these systems that have been broken for a long time and have been laid bare in extremely stark ways in the last couple of weeks. Thank you two so much for joining us on Business Unusual today. At the Stream was loving having you and everything you had to say. We're so glad you could be with us.
Thanks for
Thank
having
you,
us.
Susie. And thank you, Tiffany,
Thank you.
for all that you do, and to the good doctor who is no longer on the screen with us.
And thank you to all of us for joining us on the show today. We always love seeing your questions and comments. It's a real community here. We love seeing you come back show after show. I hope that you will also tune in tomorrow. We're always coming to you live at noon Eastern from the LinkedIn news page. Tomorrow, my colleague Caroline Fairchild will be having a discussion about diversity and inclusion in major corporations, and where does it go from here? Where does the future of that look like? I hope you'll join us then. Thank you so much, and stay safe.